I'm Margaret Ellison, 74 years old, and on the day my only grandson married, I sat in a white folding chair, hidden behind a row of columns, watching strangers pass champagne flutes without ever offering one to me. Daniel stood at the altar in a tailored blue suit, smiling into the sunlight, and when he spoke about the people who shaped his life, I listened for my name. It never came. Olivia, radiant in lace and pearls, leaned over during the ceremony, touched my arm, and called me Mrs. Ellison with a polished smile. That night, as guests laughed under strings of lights, they left me standing outside in the cool ocean breeze without a word. I didn't protest. I just held my purse a little tighter and walked away. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever found yourself quietly pushed to the edges of your own family story. I wasn't raised to make a scene. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where kindness meant bringing soup to a neighbor before they asked, and humility was simply expected. Thomas and I built a life on that foundation, he as the steady hand who ran the numbers at our transitional care home, and me as the nurse who knew every resident's name. When Daniel's parents died in a car accident, he was only 8 years old. We stepped in without a second thought, trading our quiet evenings for homework, help little league games, and making sure his world stayed as steady as it could. I packed his lunches, cheered from bleachers in every kind of weather, and sat through college essay drafts at the kitchen table long past midnight. That morning on Carmel Beach, the sunlight glinted off the water as white chairs and pale pink flowers lined the sand. Every place had a name card except mine. An usher glanced at his list, pointed me toward the back, and moved on to the next guest. I told myself it didn't matter, the day belonged to Daniel. I clapped when they exchanged vows, gathered discarded programs after the ceremony, and kept my smile fixed even when I noticed the seat reserved for grandparents at the reception table held only Olivia's grandmother. The other chair stayed empty. By the time the last song played, I had already slipped away, blending into the night like someone who'd never been there. Driving home along the quiet coastal road, I thought about how quickly you can go from being the center of someone's world to a shadow in the background. I didn't know then that the wedding was only the beginning. In a matter of days, Daniel would call and ask me to come by their new home to go over a few things about the estate, and I'd find something waiting for me on their kitchen counter that would change everything. 3 days after the wedding, Daniel called and asked if I could stop by their new place in Pacific Grove. He said there were a few things to go over about the estate, his tone even and polite. I told him I'd bring lemon bars, knowing they were his favorite when he was a boy. The drive along the coast was quiet fog hanging low over the water, the kind that turns the light silver. Their condo was part of a neat cul-de-sac lined with manicured shrubs, the kind of modern space you see in home magazines, clean lines, pale walls, and nothing out of place. Olivia opened the door dressed in a soft beige lounge set with nails polished to match. She smiled warmly, but her eyes didn't linger. The smell of strong coffee drifted in from the kitchen where Daniel stood, glass in hand, watching something on the counter. He didn't greet me with a hug, just nodded toward the marble island where a black folder with a silver clip lay waiting. I set the lemon bars down, but neither of them moved toward them. Daniel spoke first, saying they'd been reviewing the finances and thought it might be a good idea to make things simpler for the future. He explained that I'd still be part of everything, but more in a figurehead role, as he called it. He said it would be easier if he and Olivia handled decisions, so I wouldn't have the stress of managing large sums of money at my age. There was a light laugh as he said it, like it was a favor. He slid the folder toward me. The top page was labeled Trust Reassignment Addendum, printed in neat formal language. I'd seen plenty of documents like this in my years helping manage the care home, corporate phrasing, deliberate structure, but something about it was too smooth. I began turning the pages one by one, not rushing until I reached the signature page. My hand stilled. There was my name, my handwriting, even the familiar curve of my capital E. It was perfect. But I had never signed it. I looked up. Daniel's expression didn't change. Olivia scrolled on her phone, one hand wrapped around her coffee mug, as if nothing unusual was happening. I closed the folder without another word and told them I'd need time to review it. Daniel nodded easily. Olivia smiled and said to take as much time as I needed. The drive home felt longer. My eyes kept returning to that signature every loop and curve copied exactly. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the surprise had faded, leaving only a steady, quiet anger. I didn't pace or slam doors. I sat at my dining table with a cup of chamomile tea gone cold, the folder resting in front of me. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The image of my forged signature was already fixed in my mind. Around 3 a.m, I left the table and went to the spare room closet. Inside, behind a stack of old blankets, was a small metal filing box Thomas had given me after his funeral. His lawyer had said it contained documents for emergencies, but I'd been too deep in grief to look. I carried it to the kitchen table, sat down, and turned the key in the lock. Inside were manila folders, their labels faded with time. One bore Daniel's full name. Inside that folder, nestled among custody papers and school records, was a navy envelope with my name written in Thomas's hand. The letter inside was short. He told me that if Daniel ever changed toward me, the original trust was saved on a USB drive in the envelope. I was the sole trustee with full discretion until Daniel turned 30. Thomas's note was clear: protect Daniel if I could protect myself if I must. The USB was small and blue, almost old-fashioned now. I slid it into my laptop and a folder appeared labeled "For Margaret." Inside were PDF copies of the trust complete with notarized pages. I read every line. The terms were unchanged. I controlled all decisions until Daniel's 30th birthday, and distribution of assets was contingent on the heir, showing maturity, gratitude, and maintaining a relationship with me. Thomas had planned for more than I'd realized. When the first light of morning touched the edge of the window, I knew I needed another set of eyes. That afternoon, I called Patricia Rowe, our former estate lawyer from the care home days. She'd retired to a small place inland, but her voice was exactly the same steady, no-nonsense. I asked if I could bring her some papers to review. She didn't ask why, just told me to come by. Her kitchen smelled of rosemary and fresh coffee when I arrived. She spread the documents out on the table and read them slowly, line by line. When she was done, she tapped the forged trust and pointed out details I hadn't caught. The notary seal was digital and expired, the witness signatures incomplete, the formatting slightly off. She met my eyes and said firmly, "This isn't your signature." Patricia laid out my options. I could take it to court, make it public, and pursue charges, which would be long and messy. Or I could file a fraud notice, quietly freeze the estate, and gather more proof while limiting their moves. I asked if she'd be willing to represent me again. She smiled and said she'd been waiting for something interesting to do. Back home, I pulled a small voice recorder from my bedroom safe. Thomas used to bring it to meetings at the care home, saying people remembered their words better when they knew they were recorded. I charged it overnight. When Daniel called that weekend asking if I'd reviewed the papers, I told him I'd be happy to discuss them in person. He sounded relieved. On Sunday afternoon, I arrived at their condo with a container of potato salad and the recorder tucked into my purse already switched on. Daniel greeted me with a practiced smile. Olivia opened a bottle of wine and joined us at the table. They spread the same documents in front of me, but this time, Olivia took the lead. She spoke about streamlining and efficiency, glancing at Daniel for agreement. I asked calmly about the notary and the missing witness information. Daniel hesitated just a second too long. Olivia jumped in, saying a paralegal had handled it and was now out of state. She spoke quickly, and when she finished, I simply said I'd like all explanations in writing. The recorder clicked off in my purse 2 minutes later. That night, I made 3 copies of the audio file and stored them in separate places. I didn't rush to confront anyone. Instead, I decided to take one step at a time, starting with the registrar's office. The next morning, I filed a notice of suspected fraud. The clerk took my ID and the papers then disappeared into the back. 20 minutes later, a supervisor came out and explained that the estate would be frozen during an internal review. No transfers, no changes, no access. I agreed without hesitation. By the time I stepped back into the crisp coastal air, the wind had picked up. It felt different somehow, as if something in the balance had shifted. I drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let the salt air in, thinking about what to do next. Daniel and Olivia didn't know yet that their plan had already hit a wall. Patricia called 2 evenings after I filed the fraud notice. She'd been reviewing both versions of the trust and had already made a few quiet inquiries. The registrar's freeze was in place, which meant Daniel and Olivia wouldn't be able to move a dollar without my consent. Patricia suggested we keep building a clear record of every step they took from here on out. The more they try to press you, she said, the stronger your case will be if this ends up in court. I agreed, and by the time I hung up, I had a new spiral notebook open on the kitchen table. I started with the day of the wedding, noting every moment that now felt different in hindsight, the way Daniel avoided eye contact, the way Olivia introduced me to her family as though we'd just met. Then I added each call, each meeting, and every inconsistency in their explanations about the trust. I also wrote down the name of the paralegal Olivia had mentioned. Patricia promised to have a colleague discreetly look into her background. 3 days later, Daniel called again. His voice was smoother than usual, as though he were trying to take the tension out of the air. He suggested we meet one afternoon so we can make sure we're all on the same page. I agreed and chose his and Olivia's place, wanting to keep them in a setting where they felt at ease. Before leaving, I slid my recorder into my purse and checked the battery twice. When I arrived, Olivia greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Daniel gestured toward the kitchen table where the same black folder sat, but this time they had added another stack of papers on top. Olivia began talking about how they'd been thinking long-term, using phrases like streamlined decisions and future planning. Daniel sat beside her, nodding occasionally, but letting her take the lead. I let her speak without interrupting until she circled back to the documents. Then I asked calmly if they'd resolved the issues with the notary seal and missing witnesses. Daniel's jaw shifted slightly before Olivia jumped in to say they'd had a different legal assistant recheck everything and that I'd see the changes reflected in the new papers. I didn't reach for them. Instead, I said I'd prefer a full written explanation for each alteration. Olivia nodded, but her smile tightened. The recorder captured every word. Back home, I downloaded the new audio to 3 separate drives. One went into my desk drawer, another into the small lockbox in my closet, and the third into a padded envelope for Patricia. That same night, I printed both versions of the trust and marked the differences with yellow tabs. In the margin of each page, I wrote the date and where the copy had come from. The following morning, I took a drive into town. My first stop was the post office to send Patricia the audio and documents by certified mail. My second stop was a small print shop tucked behind a bakery. The young man at the counter didn't ask why I needed several bound and date-stamped copies only if I wanted them in color. I said yes, then watched as he fed each page through the machine, the hum steady in the quiet room. When I left, I walked 2 blocks to the registrar's office. The clerk behind the glass recognized me from the week before. I slid the new folder through the slot and explained that these were additional materials related to the trust dispute already on file. She nodded, took my ID, and disappeared into the back. After a short wait, a supervisor came out to confirm that the freeze remained active and that the new documents would be reviewed alongside the originals. The air outside felt cooler than when I'd gone in. Driving home, I noticed how calm my hands were on the wheel. There was no rush now, only the steady work of documenting. That afternoon, I sat in the sunroom with my notes and added a section for patterns I'd begun to see. Daniel often called in the early evening, never in the morning. Olivia always took over when the conversation turned to specifics. Any mention of outside oversight made both of them pause before responding. Patricia called again the next day with an update. The colleague she'd contacted had already flagged the second set of trust documents as suspicious. The metadata in the file indicated it had been created from an IP address linked to Olivia's firm. It wasn't conclusive, but it was another thread. Patricia suggested we let them make the next move while we kept our side airtight. That next move came faster than I expected. An envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was an invitation to a reception Olivia's family was hosting at a vineyard upstate. Under the printed RSVP line, someone had written in ink, "We hope you'll say a few words." I set the invitation on the fridge with a magnet not because I planned to forget it, but because it seemed wise to keep it in view. 2 days before the event, I called Patricia to tell her I intended to go. She advised me to keep my distance, speak only when spoken to, and observe. On the morning of the reception, I chose a navy dress and my mother's old pin, something that wouldn't stand out but would feel familiar to me. The vineyard spread out in neat rows beneath a pale sky. A young woman at the entrance checked the guest list, then excused herself to find Olivia, who came hurrying over with a bright smile. She kissed my cheek and said they'd saved me a seat with the family. At the long table, I was placed beside a woman from her side who'd never heard my name before. The afternoon passed with speeches from Olivia's father and polite applause from guests. No one asked me to speak. When I got home, the invitation went into my notebook along with a note about the seating arrangement and the general atmosphere. The following week, another envelope arrived, this one from a law firm in Sacramento I didn't recognize. The letter inside was formal, asking for clarification of trustee status and proposing an amendment to the estate distribution. It was written in measured legal phrasing, but the intent was clear: they were challenging the trust. I called Patricia as soon as I finished reading. She asked for the attorney's name, and after a pause told me he was known for representing heirs in high-value disputes. That meant someone had promised him a significant payout. I placed the letter on top of my growing stack of documents and sat quietly for a moment. Daniel and Olivia's push had just shifted into a higher gear, and I needed to be ready for where it might lead. Patricia asked me to bring the Sacramento letter to her house the next morning. When I arrived, she already had a manila folder on the table. She explained that the investigator she'd engaged had finished a deeper look at the documents Daniel and Olivia had provided. The second forgery, the one Daniel had delivered personally, hadn't just carried a faked signature. It had been drafted from an IP address tied directly to Olivia's workplace. Patricia leaned forward and said it still wasn't proof in a courtroom sense, but it was a thread that could be pulled until the whole fabric unraveled. She slid a typed letter across the table. It wasn't addressed to Daniel or Olivia, but to the Sacramento law firm. The tone was polite, even formal, declining their request for amendments and attaching copies of the forged pages with evidence markings. It also stated that any further contact should be sent to legal counsel and that criminal review was under consideration. I read it slowly, line by line, then signed my name at the bottom. Patricia nodded, saying she would have it in their hands by the following morning. That evening, I cleared the dining table and laid out everything I'd gathered so far. The original trust from Thomas's USB. Both forged versions. My notes from each conversation. The certified freeze notice from the registrar. I added the Sacramento letter to the stack, then reached for a fresh envelope. Into it went a new backup of the USB, sealed, labeled, and placed in the lockbox in my closet. Another copy went into my safe deposit box at the bank. A week passed before I heard from Daniel again. He called early one Wednesday asking if he and Olivia could stop by that morning for a face-to-face talk. I agreed and set the table for 3, making coffee and eggs. When they arrived, Daniel looked drawn, his usual easy smile missing. Olivia wore large sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. I offered them coffee. Both declined. We sat at the table, and for a moment, no one spoke. Daniel finally broke the silence, saying he hoped I realized this wasn't about pushing me out, that they were only trying to make things easier. Olivia stayed quiet except for a small nod when Daniel paused. I told them I'd reviewed everything and understood exactly what had been attempted. I spoke evenly, stating that the original trust was still valid and untouched, and that any alteration without my consent was both invalid and now part of an official record. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly. Olivia crossed her arms and leaned back, saying I was misunderstanding the situation. I answered that there was no misunderstanding, the estate was frozen. The forged documents had been archived, and the law firm had been informed. I added that I wasn't pursuing charges at this time. Daniel looked at me sharply, as if weighing whether I was offering an opening. I continued before either of them could speak, making it clear that the trust would remain under my control for the rest of my life, and that I had filed a clause locking all distributions for 5 years unless I chose otherwise. I looked at Daniel and said that any future considerations would be based on merit and conduct, not expectation. Then I told them something new. I was beginning the process of converting part of the estate into a foundation honoring Thomas's values care community and accountability. I would run it for now, and later it would be governed by a board chosen for their integrity rather than their relation to me. Olivia stood without comment. Daniel followed, saying only that he didn't want us to become a family that fought over paperwork. They left without shaking hands. I collected the empty coffee cups and set them in the sink, the house settling into silence again. That afternoon, Patricia called to ask how the meeting had gone. I told her it was finished. She asked if I felt any lighter. I said clarity was more useful than relief. That night, I sat with Thomas's old journal open on my lap. On the inside cover was a quote in his handwriting. "When you care for people, you don't owe them comfort, you owe them truth." I traced the letters with my finger, then closed the book. The next day, I began work on the foundation. I called it the Elise Foundation after my grandmother, who had raised me with the same steady hand I'd tried to give Daniel. Patricia connected me with a nonprofit consultant, and by the end of the week, we had filed incorporation papers. The mission would be to fund caregiver scholarships, support elder care programs, and provide legal aid for women facing inheritance abuse. News of the foundation traveled quietly at first, then picked up when a local paper ran a short piece about it. The article didn't mention the trust or the dispute, only that a retired nurse had dedicated part of her estate to causes that would outlast her. I clipped the article and slid it into a folder marked Private. 2 days later, a padded envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a typed letter from Daniel and a check for $100,000 made out to the Elise Foundation. In the letter he wrote that mistakes had been made, that lines had been crossed, and that decisions had been influenced by fear and bad advice. It wasn't an apology, but it was closer than I expected. I placed the letter and the check into the same folder as the newspaper clipping and returned it to the drawer. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the rosemary bush near the kitchen window swayed in the breeze. I stood there for a while, watching it bend and spring back again. In the morning, I would take the check to the bank, and the foundation's work would truly begin. The morning after I deposited Daniel's check into the foundation account, I sat at my desk in the sunroom with a stack of envelopes waiting to be opened. Most were from local organizations acknowledging the small grants we'd already issued. I read each letter carefully, setting aside a few to share with Patricia at our next meeting. The work felt steady, almost methodical, and I welcomed that kind of rhythm. Later that week, I received the registrar's final confirmation that the amended clause I'd filed months earlier was now permanently attached to the trust. That meant no distribution could occur for at least 5 years without my written approval. I made a certified copy and placed it in the lockbox alongside the other core documents. With that safeguard in place, I turned my focus fully to building the foundation's reach. Patricia and I met every Tuesday afternoon to review progress. On one of those visits, she mentioned that a reporter from a regional paper had called her asking about the Foundation's mission. She'd given them a brief statement, but avoided any mention of the trust or my family. The article appeared a week later, a small feature buried in the community section. It spoke of a retired nurse turning her family's legacy into a source of scholarships and eldercare support. I clipped the piece and tucked it into the private folder, where I kept Daniel's letter and the check. The following Sunday, I hosted a modest gathering at the community center. There was no press, no photographer, just a circle of folding chairs, a table of coffee and tea, and a dozen women sharing their stories. Some spoke of losing homes after a spouse's death. Others told of being excluded from inheritances they had counted on for stability. We didn't try to solve each other's problems. We listened. That I found carried its own kind of weight. A few days later, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from a woman named Carol Simmons, who lived 2 towns over. She had read about the foundation and wanted to thank me for giving people like her a place to turn. Her handwriting was careful, each line straight across the page, without the aid of a ruled sheet. I placed the note beside the others, feeling the pile grow week by week. Through all this, Daniel remained silent. Olivia sent one short email before Thanksgiving, wishing me good health. I responded with a polite line or two, nothing more. The holidays passed quietly. I spent them in my own home, cooking simple meals, tending to the garden when the weather allowed, and listening to the old records Thomas and I used to play on winter evenings. In early January, Patricia called with news. She'd heard from a contact at the Bar Association that the Sacramento attorney had quietly withdrawn from representing Daniel and Olivia. No official reason had been given, but she believed the weight of the evidence we'd compiled had made their case untenable. She advised me to stay the course, continue documenting, and keep the estate's freeze intact until the 5-year period was well underway. That same week, I received a phone call from a local nursing school. They'd been selected to receive the Foundation's first full scholarship award and wanted me to attend the ceremony. On the appointed day, I drove to the campus and sat in the front row as the program director announced the recipient, a young woman named Hannah Reeves. She was the first in her family to attend college and planned to work in elder care. After the ceremony, she shook my hand, her grip firm and warm. "Thank you," she said simply. Driving home that afternoon, I thought about how different that moment felt compared to the long months before it. There was no tension in my shoulders, no clock running down on a confrontation. Just the quiet knowledge that a piece of Thomas's legacy had found a new path forward. By late winter, the Foundation's work had become part of my daily life. Mornings began with reviewing applications and answering letters. Afternoons were for errands or quiet walks along the bay. Evenings belonged to the familiar routines of home. The silence in the house no longer pressed in, it simply was. One Friday in February, as I returned from the post office, I found a small padded mailer on my doorstep. The handwriting on the label was unfamiliar. Inside was a single photograph of Daniel as a boy taken in our backyard with the old maple tree in full summer leaf. On the back, in neat block letters, was written, "For the times you remembered what mattered." There was no signature. I set the photo on the mantel and stood looking at it for a long time. Whatever had prompted Daniel to send it or to have someone else send it remained unspoken. I didn't need to call him to ask. The image was enough on its own. The next morning, I placed the photograph in the private folder with the other pieces of this long, winding chapter. The folder was thick now, full of documents, letters, and moments that marked the turning of the tide. I knew the story between us wasn't over, but the shape of it had changed. What came next would not be on their terms. In early March, Patricia and I met at her kitchen table to review the Foundation's quarterly filing. She'd arranged the documents in neat stacks, each with a colored tab for the board to review later. When we finished, she set her pen down and mentioned that she'd been contacted by a financial oversight officer she knew from her years in practice. He'd heard about the forged trust documents through the registrar's review process and offered to quietly flag any unusual activity tied to the estate. I agreed, without hesitation, grateful for another set of eyes. The next week, I began receiving the first updates from that arrangement. Small details at first confirmations that no withdrawals or transfers had been attempted since the freeze and that the accounts remained untouched. It wasn't exciting news, but it was the kind that let me sleep at night. I kept each report in a new binder, marked Oversight, placing it alongside the lockbox backups. Spring brought a steady flow of applications to the foundation. Many were from individuals, but a few came from small organizations looking for partnership grants. One proposal caught my attention, a program pairing nursing students with homebound seniors for weekly wellness visits. The idea felt practical and close to what Thomas and I had valued. I scheduled a meeting with the program's director, a woman named Lisa Carver, and by the end of our conversation, we'd agreed on a pilot grant for the summer. It was during this period of calm that Daniel called again. His voice was less guarded than before, though still measured. He asked if we could meet for coffee at a cafe near the wharf. I arrived early, choosing a table by the window where the late morning light spilled across the wood. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, wearing a light jacket and no tie. He ordered a coffee, then sat with his hands wrapped around the cup. For several minutes, our conversation stayed on ordinary ground. How the winter had been small updates about the town. Then he shifted, saying he'd been thinking about the past months and wanted to find a way forward. He didn't mention Olivia, and I didn't ask. Instead, I told him plainly that my conditions hadn't changed, that the trust remained as it was, and that the foundation's funding was permanent. He nodded slowly, not arguing. Before we left, he pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. Inside was a short note, no more than a few sentences acknowledging that his earlier actions had been wrong and that he intended to respect the boundaries now in place. It wasn't formal, but it was in his handwriting. I folded the note and placed it in my bag. When I returned home, I added it to the private folder. The photograph of him as a boy sat on top, the edges beginning to curl. I closed the folder and set it back in its drawer, then made myself tea and sat by the kitchen window. Outside, the first blossoms had begun to open on the trees, a reminder that seasons turned whether or not we were ready. By April, the foundation's first major projects were underway. The scholarship program had doubled its applicants, and the wellness visit pilot had begun matching students with seniors. I attended the kickoff meeting, watching as pairs were introduced, clipboards in hand, ready to begin their first rounds. The room carried a quiet sense of purpose that reminded me of the early days at the care home. Patricia and I continued our Tuesday meetings, but now the conversations leaned more toward planning than defense. The oversight officer sent his monthly report, still no activity on the estate accounts, still no sign of outside interference. Even so, I kept the freeze in place without reconsideration. One mild afternoon in late April, while walking back from the post office, I saw Olivia across the street. She was stepping out of a boutique, a shopping bag in one hand and her phone in the other. She glanced in my direction but didn't cross over. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible, before turning toward her car. I didn't mention it to Patricia. Instead, I filed it away in my mind as one more quiet shift in the current. Whatever came next would surface in its own time. The important thing was that the foundation's work was growing roots and the estate remained under firm control. As May approached, the board for the foundation was nearly finalized. Patricia had agreed to serve in an advisory capacity, and Lisa Carver had accepted a seat representing community programs. The remaining members were drawn from local professionals with no family ties. When the first official board meeting was scheduled, I felt the same sense of readiness I used to feel before opening the care home's doors each morning. On the evening before that meeting, I sat in the sunroom reviewing my notes. The light was fading, and the air held the coolness of early summer evenings on the coast. I thought about the long months behind me, the careful steps, the quiet records, the conversations that had redrawn the boundaries of family and responsibility. Tomorrow would mark a different kind of beginning, one where the work no longer centered on defending what was left, but on building what would remain. The first board meeting for the Elise Foundation was held in early May in the small conference room at the library. The long oak table was covered with neatly stacked agendas, and a carafe of coffee sat in the center beside a plate of shortbread cookies. Patricia arrived first, carrying her leather portfolio, followed by Lisa Carver with a binder full of program updates. The other three members, all local professionals, filed in just before the hour. We began by reviewing the mission statement and the charter Patricia and I had drafted. Each member signed the document, their pens moving in quiet agreement. Lisa gave a report on the wellness visit pilot, noting that every senior in the program had received at least 2 visits so far, and that nursing students were requesting additional shifts. Her voice carried both pride and focus, the same combination I'd heard from dedicated staff in the care home years ago. When the meeting turned to finances, Patricia outlined the estate's contribution to the foundation and confirmed that the trust's locked status provided long-term security. The oversight officer's latest report was included in the packet. Still no unauthorized activity, still no attempts to challenge the freeze. I watched each board member scan the page, their expressions settling into calm. After the meeting adjourned, Patricia and I stayed behind to pack away the coffee cups. She said quietly, "This feels like the beginning of something steady." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. We locked the conference room and stepped into the mild afternoon air, the scent of freshly cut grass drifting in from the park next door. 2 weeks later, I received a call from a woman named Helen Murray, director of a regional elder care association. She'd read about the foundation's work and wanted to partner on a training program for caregivers in rural areas. We arranged to meet in person at a small cafe halfway between our towns. Helen arrived with a stack of brochures and a notebook full of ideas. Her plan was detailed but flexible, and by the end of our conversation, we had agreed to move forward with a pilot session in late summer. During those weeks, Daniel didn't call. Olivia remained absent as well. The absence felt less like avoidance now and more like a decision to step back. I didn't push for contact. Instead, my focus stayed on the foundation's growing reach. Letters continued to arrive from grant recipients, some typed, some written in looping cursive. Each one went into a separate file in the foundation's cabinet, organized by year and project type. In mid-June, the Wellness Visit program held its first appreciation luncheon. Tables were set with simple white cloths, and bouquets from local gardens brightened each centerpiece. Students and seniors sat together, talking and laughing. I found myself at a table with a retired teacher and the nursing student who visited her each week. Listening to them describe their routine, a shared cup of tea, a crossword puzzle, was a quiet reminder of why this work mattered. As summer settled in, the foundation's calendar filled with events and deadlines. Patricia kept the board updated between meetings, and Lisa managed the day-to-day coordination of programs. My role shifted toward oversight and long-term planning. It was during one of those planning sessions that Patricia mentioned a letter had arrived at her office addressed to both of us. The return address was Daniel's. We opened it together. Inside was a brief note stating that he understood the estate's current terms and would not contest them. There was no request for changes, no mention of Olivia, only a line wishing the foundation continued success. Patricia folded the letter carefully and handed it to me. "For your records," she said. I took it home and placed it in the private folder alongside the photograph, the earlier note, and the check. The folder was almost full now, each item a marker of the path from conflict to something closer to resolution. That evening, I sat in the sunroom watching the light fade over the garden. The lavender was in bloom, its scent carrying through the open window. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't waiting for the next disruption. Still, I knew there was one more step ahead, something I had been considering quietly since the early days of the dispute. It wasn't about defense anymore. It was about leaving a structure in place that could stand on its own, no matter what the future brought. That thought stayed with me as the days grew longer, shaping the plans I would bring to the next board meeting. By the time autumn settled in, the board had voted unanimously to approve the long-term sustainability plan I'd been working on. It outlined every procedure, every safeguard, and every funding source the foundation would need to thrive without my constant oversight. Patricia called it the blueprint, and Lisa joked that we should frame it. To me, it felt like the last stone in a wall I'd been building for years. A wall meant not to keep people out, but to protect something good inside. In early October, we hosted a small gathering in the community hall to celebrate the foundation's first year. The room was filled with board members, volunteers, seniors, and students who had been part of our programs. Tables were lined with photographs from events, and the air carried the scent of cinnamon from the pies cooling on the dessert table. I gave a short speech thanking everyone for their dedication. Looking around, I saw not just faces but threads, each person connected to the next, through a web of kindness and persistence. After the speeches, a retired nurse named Margaret came up to me. She'd been part of our wellness visits since the pilot stage. With a gentle smile, she said, "You may have started this because of what you went through, but it's going to keep going because of what we all believe in now." Her words settled deep inside me. For the first time, I felt the truth of it. The foundation was no longer mine alone. That evening, after the hall was quiet and the chairs were stacked away, I drove home under a sky brushed with silver clouds. In the kitchen, I poured a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the wind carry the last of the leaves across the lawn. I thought about the long road from those first tense weeks through the meetings, the doubts, and the quiet victories. Justice, I realized, wasn't always a single moment. Sometimes it was the slow, steady work of building something that couldn't be undone. I haven't heard from Daniel or Olivia since his letter. Maybe that's for the best. Some doors close quietly, not out of anger, but because both sides know it's time to walk away. What remains is the choice of how to use the peace that follows. For me, it's this work and the people who share it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that standing your ground doesn't have to be loud or bitter. It can be steady, thoughtful, and rooted in care for yourself and for the future you want to leave behind. Thank you for listening to my story. If it's made you think about the ways dignity and kindness can shape justice, I hope you'll share it. And if you've walked your own road to a hard-won peace, I'd be honored to hear it.